32 nations from all over the globe are about to meet in the world's biggest sporting event. There'll be ever-presents like Brazil and newbies like Qatar all in one place. Talking of firsts, let's go back to the first World Cup that I can clearly remember and take a look at the 2010 South Africa edition. Apologies if that made any of you feel old. Everyone seems to love this World Cup, and on the face of things, this was a great World Cup. The music, the players, underdog stories and giant killings. This World Cup had it all, but at the same time, it really didn't. Firstly, we'll start out with the most important aspect of football, the ball itself. These days everybody loves the Jabulani. The way it moves in an unpredictable manner can be massively entertaining to watch, in small doses. A lot of people have let nostalgia and Diego Forlan compilations trick them into thinking that this ball added excitement to the World Cup. But it didn't. If anything, it did the opposite. If the player wanted to hit the ball any further than 10 feet, the Jabulani would become airborne and never really came back down. Free kick after free kick went over, crosses soared out of play, and as every goalkeeper went to take a goal kick, spectators in Rose Ed must have been clutching their vuvuzelas and praying the ball wouldn't hit them. It was terrible and was all down to incompetence from FIFA and the design team at Adidas behind the ball. Now I understand, in theory the roundest ball in the world sounds perfect and makes complete sense. But you're telling me that a group of scientists and one of the biggest sporting brands in the world didn't manage to work out that their ball was too round? It's ridiculous. And arguably even worse, how did FIFA do no quality control and actually check the ball out with some half decent tests so they could see the ball would not be up to standard for a World Cup? We had to see on 64 separate occasions some of the most one-dimensional and boring football to ever grace a World Cup, simply because it was too risky for teams to play the ball in the air. I'll get back onto this later, but I want to talk about a more important subject first, the controversy behind South Africa hosting the World Cup. We've all heard about the corruption at FIFA, which allegedly led to Qatar receiving the role of hosting this year's World Cup, but many people have forgotten the fact that in 2015, we found out that South Africa had bribed senior FIFA officials on 2 occasions to better their chances of hosting the World Cup. Now let me make one thing clear. The whole continent of Africa deserved this World Cup. In no world should the United States have hosted the World Cup before a country in Africa had, especially given we'd already seen their North American neighbours Mexico host the competition twice in the previous 25 years. But a continent's first World Cup shouldn't have come like this. Africa's first ever World Cup will forever be tainted with the fact it should have never been there in the first place. But to be honest, I find it hard to blame South Africa. For years and years, FIFA have underfunded and ignored African football. Because in their eyes, why would they spend money and time sorting out a corrupt system and fixing it, when they themselves would prove to be a corrupt organisation which only cared about money? What made this worse was the problem in society that in Western media, Africa is very often ignored or misportrayed. And so there's nobody asking questions as to why the continent had never hosted a World Cup. The media rarely covers the best sporting and cultural accomplishments of the continent, so giving it a World Cup was the least of FIFA's concerns. And so, a desperate national FA felt the need to bribe them. In no way do I at all condone what South Africa did. I more just understand it, and I don't think it's at all comparable to the Qatar situation. It was more a situation of 2 wrongs not making a right, but in hindsight, the competition had already started out adversely. Moving on to just football, the sport was certainly in a transitional time. Technology had become more important, and off-the-field issues such as mental health were starting to become more and more understood. The game was moving away from the flair and beauty of individual players built into a squad that we saw in the 90s and 2000s, and more about the team working as one. Now in theory, you'd think this may suit a team like previous World Cup winners Italy, who'd been so used to having a compact defensive unit working together for years. But like I mentioned earlier, there was one big problem: the Jabulani. Without the ability to play the ball forward quickly, it meant the Italians would struggle to break teams down. Italian domestic football at the time was all about slowing the pace of the game down while out of possession or when defending a lead, but quick passes in attacking phases allowed them to break through defences when a goal was needed. Of course, the Jabulani wasn't the only problem with the Italy side of the World Cup. Marcello Lippi's insistence on his sides consisting of 2 separate blocks didn't necessarily work the way you'd think, and instead of making each section of the side work more as a team, it created division. Lippi would also start his team with 3 different formations in each of the group stage games, leading to confusion in the team and his side being knocked out in the group stage. With teams already struggling to play well, having the supposed best national team in the world being out of the competition before it even really started would just hinder how the football elitists would view the tournament. But even Italy wouldn't be the worst of the world's big hitters. France would maybe have the most chaotic team of any team in recent history. First of all, as I'm sure many of you are aware, France should have never even been at the World Cup. They only made it to South Africa through the playoffs, in which Thierry Henry cheated, using his hands to keep the ball in play and knocking the ball across for William Gallas to grab a winner against Ireland. It's fair to say that France were destined for failure before even getting on the plane. Then once in South Africa, forward Nicolas Anelka clashed with manager Raymond Domenech, leading to him being sent home early. In retaliation, the French players went on strike, refusing to train. As you can imagine, with all this happening and a ball the players didn't know how to use, France didn't do too well. In fact, that's a massive understatement. They did terribly. Winning just 1 point and coming last in a group with Uruguay, Mexico and South Africa, France probably had the worst World Cup of anybody. And with 2 European giants having been knocked out in the group stage, a stigma around the tournament would start to grow in mainland Europe. That the competition was of particularly low quality, and to be honest, it's hard to disagree with. Just 4 of the 16 games played in the second half of the tournament ended with the victors winning by more than a single goal. Now I love a scrappy, tense game as much as everyone, but when almost every game becomes one, it turns from being tense to being boring. If a team went 1-0 down, it almost looked impossible to win, because your chances of scoring twice in a game looked nearly undoable now the lower level opposition had been knocked out. And with more neutrals than ever before watching the knockouts, the tournament seemed more like a punishment than something that could be enjoyed. As I mentioned earlier, football was in a very significant transitional period, and many teams were seeing the last of an ageing group of players. Of the big nations, France, Argentina, England, Italy, Brazil, Portugal and even Germany were all in a period of transition, either seeing their last tournament with a group of players or their first with a fresh bunch. The only 2 sides that really looked to have a well-rounded squad were Spain and the Netherlands. You'll never guess who made the final. When you have this many of the big nations without a squad as good as you'd expect, the quality of the competition was undeniably not as high as usual. You may think that would be a positive. It would allow a more competitive tournament, which surely would be more interesting. But the problem was, with the Jabulani, every ounce of entertainment in each fixture was sapped out, and nobody was enjoying themselves. With every unexpected positive, there's a negative to cancel it out. Now, as a 6 turning 7-year-old from London, this was my first real experience of proper international football. Sure, I'd have seen qualifiers and friendlies, but with England having missed out on Euro 2008 and me having been around 2 or 3, I'd barely have been able to remember anything from the 2006 World Cup. I didn't quite understand how much of a mess the England national team actually were, but I'd collected all of the England match attacks and I was ready for us to bring football home, starting with a comprehensive victory against the annoying USA. With the mighty Rob Green in goal, nothing could go wrong. Well, no big deal. The US were probably our hardest opponent. We'd batter Algeria. Oh, never mind. Next up was only Slovenia. And look at that, we won. Despite a rusty start, England were on the up going into knockouts, with the players finally having gotten used to the Jabulani. All of the technological issues from FIFA were out of the way, and nothing could stop the 3 Lions from breezing through to the quarters. Oh, for Now, of course, for many this moment is probably one of the greatest World Cup moments of all time. The English aren't exactly loved universally, but a 7-year-old me was absolutely fine with it, to be honest. For some reason I didn't actually care very much. The Scottish half of my family must have gotten to me or something. Anyways, by now you can see that this tournament certainly had its highlights, especially when you can go back and look at them without having to live through all the dross. But there had clearly been something wrong with this World Cup. However, there was one shining light. A Ghanaian side filled with a mix of experience and raw talent were making waves, and having made it through the tightest group in the tournament, Ghana had beaten America in the last 16, and if they could get past Uruguay, then they'd become the first African team to ever reach the semi-final of a World Cup. And all this would be occurring in the first ever World Cup in Africa. This Ghana side were destined for greatness, and on the stroke of half time they went ahead through Solly Montari. Diego Forlan then equalised after the break, and the game went to extra time. With just moments left on the clock, Ghana saw Luis Suarez block a goal-bound header on the line, except of course, he used his hands. It's funny because you'd never have expected cheating from someone like Luis Suarez either. He always seemed like a good egg. I'm sure you all know how this went. Jan missed the spot kick, and Uruguay went on to win on penalties. The clash between the two sides was like a metaphor for the whole World Cup. So close to greatness, but in the end, controversies got in the way. Like I mentioned earlier, the whole knockouts were a bit of a letdown. Spoiler alert for those who somehow don't know who won the World Cup, it was Spain. Pep Guardiola's Barcelona side had been at the forefront of the global footballing transition, and Spanish clubs were seeing more success in Europe, meaning tiki-taka was on top of the world. Mix into that a ball that works best with short passes back and forth, rather than counter-attacking long ball football, and Spain clearly had a huge advantage in this World Cup. People often look at the possession stat as one for dominance in a game, using it as an indicator for who was the more attacking side, but instead, Spain had used possession, and still do in my opinion, to be defensive. To put it very simply, they'd keep the ball until they scored a goal, and once they'd scored, they'd continue to just hold the ball, preventing the opposition from creating any chances whatsoever. Spain held over 60% possession in 6 of their 7 games, conceding just twice in the entire tournament, with both goals coming in the group stages. In a tournament where teams were struggling to create meaningful chances anyway, the eventual winners deciding to make every game into a bore fest just made things even worse. Now at this stage, I've made the tournament look like a failure, but let's not forget, if you ask football fans what their favourite recent World Cup was, 9 out of 10 of them choose this one, and there has to be a reason for that. Firstly, I mentioned the relatively boring knockout stages a lot, but I didn't mention the fact that there were still some great moments within them. From Van Bronckhorst's screamer against Uruguay in a 3-2 semi-final, to Germany bagging 8 goals in just 2 games, any game not involving Spain did have some good moments. And surprisingly, the group stages may have actually seen the best of the Jabulani. We've all seen what Forlan could do with it, but it also made each group a lot tighter, with many teams still being in the running going into the final game. Even if you look at the star performers, they came in all shapes and sizes, young or old. Where else would you see a 21-year-old Thomas Müller battle it out with a 31-year-old Diego Forlan for player of the tournament? Legends were made and defeated, even if it may not be in the way you'd want or expect. Look, nostalgia is a powerful thing, but something being completely timeless is even more powerful. Going from the start of the World Cup, there are aspects of it which are still unbelievable to this day. Starting off with 2 of the greatest World Cup songs ever produced, and Waving Flag is truly a masterpiece. When it came to showcasing the culture of South Africa and the continent, whilst mixing it in with the global event that's the World Cup, they did a fantastic job. The purpose of the World Cup is to bring nations from anywhere and everywhere together, where cultures can be understood and appreciated, and it's meant to be a mixing pot of everything great in football. And the South Africa World Cup maybe did it better than any tournament before them. We saw things we'd never seen before in football, the vuvuzela being one of them. At the time, many people hated the noise they produced, but I've personally always been a fan. I don't think there's anything more entertaining than hearing the most obnoxious noise possible from a ridiculous number of people all in one place. And if you fast forward to the present, more and more people agree with me. Like I said, nostalgia is very powerful and tends to make people overrate things from the past. But on the other hand, you could say that something which seems to be better and better as each year goes by may just mean it had been underappreciated at the time. Are we just overrating the Jabulani and vuvuzelas now? Or were we just not ready for them in 2010? It's truly an interesting debate, and the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle. And I said in the title and thumbnail that the South Africa World Cup was terrible, but at the same time, if so many people can see greatness in it, I must be somewhat wrong. Sure, it had its faults, but most of them are out of the hands of those that were affected by them. It's not the South Africans' fault that FIFA had completely ignored African football for so long, meaning the only way of being noticed was through money. It's not the players' fault that the Jabulani was so hard to use. It's not Ghana's fault that Luis Suarez and his cheating antics stopped them from making history. But they all happened, and maybe I just need to look for the positives in them. Yeah, the 2010 South Africa World Cup wasn't perfect. It certainly wasn't the best on the pitch, and off-pitch manufacturing faults, like an accidentally unusable ball, certainly didn't help. But you know what else isn't perfect? The world. So maybe a World Cup that's both overrated and terrible in terms of footballing quality actually makes it the best World Cup at the same time. I think it's fair to say that anybody's opinion on the 2010 World Cup is likely both right and wrong. And if the upcoming World Cup in Qatar is spoken about anywhere near as much as the 2010 one still is, 12 years down the line, then it's probably been very successful. What I'm trying to say is, despite my title saying how bad the 2010 World Cup was, what made the South Africa World Cup so good was that it was so flawed. I might have been right in saying that the South Africa World Cup was the worst football-wise, but what takes place on the pitch is just half of what makes a good World Cup. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a bit of a weird one, to be fair. I didn't really delve into any topic very specifically. I more just started talking and didn't really stop. But if you enjoyed the way I did it and you're new around here, why not like and subscribe? I'll be doing many more videos on the World Cup in the near future, don't you worry. And finally, comment what specific video topics you'd like me to cover. But most importantly, enjoy your day.